My name is Belle. I'm with PennEnvironment. I'm calling from Philadelphia right now. And I have written a letter to the editor, really just for the first time last fall, and was very intimidated at first. But now it's actually pretty simple, and it doesn't always have to be too complicated as I thought it was. So it's been cool to be able to get a couple of those out there. So, what is a letter to the editor? As you can probably guess from the name, it's a short article or letter that readers of a newspaper or some sort of written media submit to the editor or really submit to the paper. It's usually in response to an article that's been written, but it can be about a recent event, something in the news, or just some sort of timely piece that the newspaper or media outlet might want to cover. We really use LTEs as a big tactic in our grassroots advocacy work because, again, it's a great way for the just public, like Pennsylvania citizens, to get their voices heard. It also helps to get media coverage for our campaigns. It doesn't necessarily have to be a 2-minute story on the evening news to mean that someone out there is reading it or that they're get more eyes on the story. I'm often getting a letter to the editor published is a great way to, potentially get like thousands of people to read your opinion or read something that supports one of the campaigns that we're working on. Of course, in this case, community energy. And letters from citizens can also have a really great and big impact on elected officials. We, in one of our earlier blocks, sent emails to our elected officials and wrote letters. This is another way of, calling on them to do something, but sometimes when you do it in a very public setting, like a newspaper, it can apply even more pressure to them to actually take action. Or, if you are thanking them for an action they've taken, it's a great way to get more eyes on the celebration and the great work that they've done. So we use them a lot in the work that we do, and a lot of groups that do this kind of advocacy use them as well. To the right here is just a lot of I guess, titles of a lot of papers that we submit to from across the state. So there's really no limit to who you can submit a letter to the editor to as long as they have a history of publishing them. It's great to get one in. And we'll talk about submission in a second. Here's a sort of quick skinny on how to write an LTE. We'll go through in more detail the actual steps to it in a second. But the first thing that really makes a good LTE, and one of the biggest ways you can make it more likely to be read if it's published, is to have a good hook. A good first sentence or two that really get people um, reading your letter and kind of engaged in the content. This can look like a personal anecdote. It can look like a recent event that just happened, something that people might know about, or it can look like responding directly to an article that paper wrote. I have two examples on the right here. One at the top was written by one of our interns about our campaign against e-waste or electronic waste. As you can see, she starts it out with like, the moment I noticed my phone battery was draining faster than I could scroll, I decided to get it fixed. That's just a story about something that she experienced, but a ton of people have probably also experienced where their phone stops holding battery, and so they try to go get it fixed. But as you can see, she needed additional unnecessary repairs to fix issues unrelated to the battery. So a good one can be like a personal story going through something that a lot of people relate to. Or if you look at the story at the bottom there, that's one that I wrote last fall about the really sort of heat wave we got early on in the school year, about how just days into the first week of classes for Reading students, several schools closed early due to excessive heat. That's pretty much, directly a recent event that just happened, and I outlined it there, but people were familiar with that not only did it get the newspaper interested in running the story, but also was more likely that people reading it would understand what I was talking about right away. So finding a good hook is oftentimes the most difficult part of an LTE, but really sets up your letter for success. Another good tip is to make your letter as personal as possible. You want to find what your connection to the topic is. So in the first letter there, it was about her phone. She directly experienced what it was like to be told it's cheaper just to get a new phone and throw out your old one than actually getting it fixed. Or you can write about, in the case of community solar, your experience with maybe trying to get solar panels if you couldn't, or an experience of a community that wasn't able wanted to share in an energy project but was unable to. It takes a little bit of thinking to find what might make it personal, but it again sort of helps get readers connected to that story. A third big tip on how to write an LTE is you want to focus on just one point, one call to action. When we talk about, clean renewable energy, we could go in 1,000 different ways. But today we want to focus on calling on our legislators to pass the clean energy bill or the community energy bill. That's the point we're really focusing in on, and our LTE will span or just encompass that one main issue. We could talk about um, all the different ways that we could get more renewable energy or what it means to install solar panels and the logistics of that. But it's going to make our letter to the editor too long. And that falls right into sort of the fourth tip on how to write a letter to the editor is they're short. The word limit ranges depending on the paper, but they're usually about 200, maybe 225. Some papers I've seen as short as 150, some go up to 300 or 400. But you typically want to keep your LTE in the 200 word count range. That way, usually the shorter they are while still giving all the correct information, the more likely they are to be published. So these are just some general tips and kind of an idea of how to write an LTE. Again, we'll go through the specific ones for community energy in just a moment. And then my last slide here is a sample outline for what you want it to look like. So again, you want a catchy lead, a good hook, maybe a reference to a recent article. You want to state the problem or what you're concerned about, why you're writing. Then you want to state the solution. That will often take the bulk of the kind of LTEs we write about, calling for certain legislation. Give a final why. Why should people care? Why should someone take action? Why is community energy the right thing to do? And then sign off with your name and where you're from. You also want to provide your email and your phone number. In my experience, if a paper is going to publish your LTE, they'll usually check in with you beforehand. So you want to make sure you have the right information there so they can contact you for anything they might need. Again, these are two sort of example LTEs that our volunteers and interns have written about in the past. They, for the most part, follow that structure, have a good hook, a example of what the solution, or a good hook, state what the problem is, have the solution, and then have a good call to action. I am going to stop sharing this presentation and check in, see if there are any questions about all of that. Again, I have a document that has more specific community energy stuff, but just any questions in general about letter to the editor, what's involved. Yeah, Wendy.
So two thoughts and a question. You mentioned leaving your email address and phone number. My husband once wrote a letter to the editor that I thought was awesome, and it did not get published. And we think what happened was there was a call to his phone that he didn't recognize the number, so he didn't pick it up. And we really suspect that that was the paper calling to confirm. So if you write a letter to the editor, pick up all those calls. Second thing, and maybe get your opinion on this, I've heard that even if your letter does not get published, it does get read, and the newspaper will say, okay, we're not going to publish this, but gosh, this is like the fifth letter we've gotten on this topic, so maybe we should pay more attention to it. And then my question is, should you give like citations, references in your letter? I know those won't get published, but if you say, the state of Pennsylvania, and you quote some statistic and then link it to your source, is that important? Even though they won't use it in the paper?
Yeah, great thoughts and a great question. To answer your question first, yes, typically what we do is include a link, especially when it's something that you would cite anyways, like it's not common knowledge. They don't usually get published in the paper, but it is helpful if whoever is writing your letter wants to check that you're actually right in what you're saying. And they're not going to publish false information. They'll typically check it out. So yeah, it's always good to put in a hyperlink or include your sources at the bottom. That way they can double check that. Absolutely.
Okay.
And then really great comment, yeah, about the ways that uh, the people who oversee letter to the editors will connect with you before they actually publish something. They'll call. So make sure to pick up your phone. They'll email, check your spam in the week sort of following the LTE. And then yes, your other good point too. When we get a lot of letters to the editor submitted, the paper notes that. Just like when you leave a message at an elected official's office, someone tracks it somewhere that, oh, we just got 10 hits about community energy. Maybe we should look into that. The public cares about it. So absolutely. It makes a difference whether it gets published or not, which is the cool thing. Nice. What I'm going to do now is put a link in the chat to a document that is our community energy LTE guide. So you should all be able to access that now. And it's a document that runs through a lot of what I just went through in the spreadsheet, but for me, I'm more of a visual learner. I have to have it right in front of me, so that always helps. It runs through why we write a letter to the editor. So again, they're typically kind of one of the more read parts of a newspaper. People like to check out what their community thinks. Elected officials might sometimes check in to see what their constituents are thinking. It's a cool place to see, not articles that weren't written by trained journalists, but just what the community thinks. So a lot of people do check that part of the paper out. It goes through a little bit more on how to write a letter to the editor. So giving some of the good tips that I went through, the sample outline, again, of a catchy lead, problem, solution, call to action. It also then dives into more of the specific community solar stuff. So if you scroll down to the top of page 2, and if you don't have access to this document, or if you want me to share my screen to make it easier, let me know. But when we're at the top of page 2 here, you should see a section that says background information. This is some just pretty general background information on community energy. If you tuned in to the kickoff meeting earlier, or you've been to one of the other sessions today, you probably heard some similar stuff that's listed here. But gives an idea of the environmental issues Pennsylvania has faced, why we want community energy, why we want more renewable energy, in any form incorporated into Pennsylvania. I will make a note that there are, at least in this LTE guide, aren't too many specific numbers or facts included. Mostly because like the information that's been put out from Schweier and Schwenk, the two lead sponsors, doesn't have too much specific cool facts to throw out or stuff like that. I actually wanted to check in, maybe Monica, if you know if there are any, you know, like expected savings or how much solar could be generated, anything like that, that either you guys have from the past community solar bills or something you've seen about these community energy pieces. Because I haven't seen too many sort of good, numbers or statistics to put out there.
There is no specific number for savings in the bill, which is a little bit strategic. So what I would say is ensure that there are guaranteed savings. That is important language to include, and it kind of leaves open. It could be in other states, maybe you could say it this way. In other states, they save on average of 10% annually on their electric bills. So that can be a good kind of call to the language, or, like an aspiration that we might have.
I have solar cells, and then for the additional power, I've have want renewable energy, and that actually costs more than the Pico price. So how is solar for, I don't understand how it's going to save money, I guess. I mean, yeah. So when you buy the renewable energy on the marketplace, AEP is the one that I just signed up with. It's 11 cents and the other one's 9 cents.
Yeah.
Oops.
Oh, I'm sorry. Belle,
Did
do you
it-
want me to take this?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so Jean, that's such a good question. So the way PA Power Switch works is they're alternative retail suppliers. The way community solar would work is that you would subscribe to the system and ideally be billed right through your utility. And since the bill is going to direct the program, the community solar program, to save everyone money, they will have to make sure that it costs less for you to subscribe to community solar than for you to just be on default service through PICO or PPL. And in which case, it'll also definitely be less than if you were to buy the 100% renewable energy option through PA Power Switch. So it's really just because of that guaranteed savings language in the bill, which is why it's really important that that gets included.
So when you're writing a letter to the editor, you do want to link to this co-sponsorship memo. Again, it helps the editor or whoever's reading it sort of know the legitimacy of what you're writing about. It can also give some good context if they want to check anything. So that is linked in the background section here. Again, the co-sponsorship memo is the representative or senator saying, I intend to introduce this bill. I'm proposing this kind of legislation. They just haven't actually introduced it yet. When you scroll down to where it says LTE outline / talking points, kind of the next section here, it runs through the outline, but in more detail and with more relevance to community energy. So you'll see, again, finding a personal anecdote or reason about why you're concerned about climate change or climate pollution, or why you want to increase renewable energy here in Pennsylvania, why you want to provide more access to renewable energy, overall, why you support community energy. You can also reference a recent news article, something about the climate, about energy, maybe about the high utility bills a lot of people have been seeing and how community energy can help with that. Then you'll want to state the problem and the topic. So that kind of reiterates a little bit of the background information. The statistics that we do have here are ones that have come from PennEnvironment, a little bit more environmentally focused, about how currently only 4% of Pennsylvania's electricity comes from renewable sources, which is really low when you compare that to like Texas that has 30%. I think Iowa might almost be at like 80% renewable energy, which is crazy. We've got a little bit to go. That's a good statistic to throw in there. Another good reason why we want to incorporate more renewables like solar, like geothermal. Getting into the solution, once again, I've linked the co-sponsorship memos there. And then the end part here, our final why and call to action. This is typically the last sentence or last note you'll end your letter to the editor on. For this, kind of the sentence I put together is that we're calling on the legislature to pass these critical policies as quickly as possible this session to help increase clean energy in the Commonwealth and allow more Pennsylvanians access to renewable energy that will help the environment and save money on electricity bills. That's really what we're trying to do with these letters, is to get these bills introduced and passed and supported as quickly as possible. So that's the general call to action you want at the end. You're more than welcome to, that sentence is not set in stone. Tweak it however, feels best for you, however it fits in your letter to the editor. Really the key point we want to make there is we want our representatives and our senators to support this bill and get it through as soon as possible. We want the General Assembly. We want to get it to the governor's desk. Some kind of phrase or statement like that that demonstrates what we want to accomplish with this letter and what we want our elected officials to do. Yeah, Monica.
Yeah, I was just going to add on to your point about the final call to action and kind of the urgency of the request. So, just like for context for everybody, last year, something that we heard a lot from decision makers, so like Senate leadership, was what's the rush? Why do we need to pass community solar now? And so, addressing that early on can be very compelling. And the thing that I was thinking about was this is the time to talk about cost savings. You know, we are in just kind of an economic free fall. So, you know, you talk about don't we deserve to save money right now? That can be very motivating, I think, for a lot of people. So I just wanted to add that in.
Yeah, absolutely. And raises a good point here too. If you want to add in other reasons why you support community energy, of course, like with PennEnvironment's language, we're pretty focused on the environmental aspect. But if you and your work or your experience with community energy want to add in a different part, more than welcome. Um, and kind of the big thing we'll do here right now is brainstorm an outline and what your hook wants to be. And if you want to add in other facts, we can do a little bit of research on that. So we can go ahead and move on to kind of that next part. But I also want to check again if anyone has any questions or things to help clarify after we went through the LTE guide. Yeah, Wendy.
So just a quick question. I get emails from so many different groups, and I'm pretty sure that this is not the same thing, but an email that I got this morning was about House Bill 362 that has something to do with solar, and that's something very different from this, correct?
Monica, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, Wendy, good question. That is Solar for All. That is a grant program to provide money for solar systems for low to moderate income homeowners.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so that's totally separate.
Okay.
But good question.
Yeah, a lot of good solar stuff going on out there. Kind of the next steps in writing a letter to the editor is writing a letter to the editor. So we usually how I like to start this out, and I think what helps best with the writing process is to do a little bit of brainstorming slash researching to think about how you want to open your letter. Have you seen in the news recently a good article that relates to this? Maybe something in your area about solar in general, or about renewable energy in Pennsylvania, about the utility prices and electricity costs going up, something along those lines, something about people wanting to share in energy projects. Have you read something recently that you want to respond to, or maybe you want to take a minute or two and look for an article that relates to any of those? Or you can take, and or really, you can take a second to think about your personal connection to community solar. So, Jean, you mentioned that you have solar panels, you have solar access in your home. Has anyone come up to you and said, like, I wish that I could get that, but there's a big tree in my backyard, or my roof isn't south facing, or I'm a renter and I can't get solar on it? Because that can be a good way to open the letter about how you've been able to experience solar and want other people to experience it as well. Something like that, a personal story or a hook to a recent article is a really great place to start. And I think we can take the next, 5 to 6 minutes, really however long it takes, just do that kind of research. I might actually, write one too, because I haven't written one about community energy yet. And I'm a renter right now, so thinking about how I could incorporate more solar into my home as well. Yeah.
Personally, I have solar panels, so I wish I could say, oh, I want solar, but I have it.
That's a great way too to, you've been able to see the great benefits of solar. Would love other people to be able to get involved, especially those who can't, or renters, or don't have, would need to replace their roof, face any kind of barrier to doing it. It's great to.
Yes. So that might be a good hook for me. Yeah, we have solar panels. We were able to afford them, but we have neighbors who said, "Oh, we'd love to get solar," and they're a young couple just starting out. When they heard the upfront cost, which is not insignificant, they're like, "Okay, never mind." So yeah, maybe I could highlight my young neighbors not being able to take advantage like we were able to do it because, you know, we don't have a mortgage anymore. We're at a point in our life where, you know, kids are through. Anyway,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that's a really great way to open because you can chat. Yeah, like we just said, you've been able to experience it, want others to. Doing this community solar or community energy, community solar, leasing energy that way can fill in the time until people are able to save up and get solar panels themselves.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Yeah, that's a great hook, Wendy. The other one I will mention, this may not be relevant to you, but maybe to somebody out there, is seniors who are now on fixed income after they retired will not be able to afford solar, or they won't be able to take the tax credit that helps reduce the cost of solar. So I think we talk about renters a lot, but I think in Pennsylvania, it would be really relevant to people on fixed income too.
Well, it seems like Wendy, you've got a good hook there. I think, you know, if I write one, I would think a lot about being an environmentalist, but kind of being restricted in my choices because I like being a renter and can't afford a home, let alone, you know, solar panels to put on it. So thinking about that stuff. Nice. Then once we kind of have that hook or what we want to start with, as you can see from the guide, the next step is to outline in some way, you know, maybe a sentence or two on what the problem is. You know, your neighbors aren't able to get their own solar because number one, you know, that's a big upfront cost. But number two, there's currently no system in place that would allow them to even share in a project. So the solution is community solar, community energy, and this bill that will let you know, people, multiple people share a part of one energy project. That's sort of typically, I think, the next steps would be talking about the problem and how community energy is the solution. So we can also take a second here to kind of think about really just get into writing it, a sentence or two for each of these parts about the problem, about the solution.
I just wanted to make sure I want to like have like a super, super short definition of community energy and tell me if I've got the language right. I'll mention the young family can't afford it because of upfront costs. And I say, community energy is a good solution to this formidable financial barrier. With community energy, multiple families subscribe to a single local energy source, such as a small scale solar project. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. That's a really perfect way to describe it too.
Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of, you know, sharing the wealth or all getting in one part. That's great. Nice. But how do you feel it's coming along?
I'm like, I think 70% there. I just need to, you know, clean it up a bit and I should be able to get it out today or tomorrow, hopefully.
Yeah.
But yeah.
That's awesome. Great. And then, as I mentioned, the last bit there, the call to action, the sentence that I have here, it's a little bit long, but again, the main part we want to get out is that, you know, that's why you can say something similar to, you know, I'm calling on the legislature to pass these critical policies as soon as possible. You know, something as simple as that. You can get more into, you know, to protect our environment or to, you can bring it back to the beginning there of to allow my neighbors to, you know, be environmental stewards and help the earth and get energy from solar. I urge the legislature to pass these policies as quickly as possible. There's a lot of different avenues to run to kind of tweak that, but I think the biggest part there is we're calling on the legislature to pass these bills as quickly as possible. That's really the main part that has to be in there. So that's why we're writing the LTE, but I hope that makes sense.
Yeah.
If you think it looks good, then I will hopefully read it in the newspaper soon.